Hello and welcome to the show. So we're going to be doing things a little differently tonight. We are taking tomorrow night off to regroup and work on some things. So we're going to be doing our long form sit down interview tonight. And then tomorrow night, there will be no show, but we will be back Monday with another great one for you. So again, no show tomorrow night, but we will be back Monday. Now, our guest tonight is Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek is running for president in the 2024 race. He's currently vying for the Republican nomination and is fighting a steep uphill battle against frontrunners like Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. Now, Vivek is not your typical presidential candidate. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Andrew Yang. He's never run for office, he's young, and he's a wealthy business entrepreneur with different ideas on how the country should be run. Vivek made his money in the biotech industry making pharmaceuticals. And with the way people are feeling about the pharmaceutical companies these days, we're going to surely be asking him about his ideas on the COVID pandemic and vaccines, as well as taking money for his campaign. Now, before we get to our guest, we need to get to our sponsors. Genucel is an amazing skincare line that has upgraded their most popular package, that's the name of it, to feature their top-selling deep firming vitamin C serum plus ultra retinol moisturizer with natural retinol alternative. And right now, you can take advantage of this limited time package upgrade for 70% off. Now, I have been using Genucel after I saw someone with the best skin I have ever seen. And when I asked her if what she was using, she said Genucel. This is a 100% true story. So I've been using it for a few months now, and I really do feel like my skin is more supple with fewer wrinkles. Genucel's secret is a family recipe for over 20 years that makes it safe for all skin types and perfect for both men and women, made by a compounding pharmacist in small batches and always safe, cruelty-free, and natural. So go to genucel.com/Kim, and you can save over 70% off Genucel's most popular package featuring both the Genucel Ultra Retinol and Genucel Firming Serum. So go to genucel.com/Kim, and you can use the promo code Kim for an additional bit off from your order. Okay, our next great sponsor, before we get on with our discussion with Vivek Ramaswamy, is Field of Greens. Now, I love this stuff. This is a fine powder. It's made from dehydrated whole fruits and vegetables that are carefully selected to give you the most nutrients in your diet possible. You just take a scoop of this powder, mix it into your ice water or your iced tea, and it actually tastes really delicious. And this is just an easy way to get all of your fruits and vegetables into your diet. Now, personally, I like the lemon lime flavor, but they also have a mixed berry. They have an energy version that'll give you a little boost for your workout. They also have a natural flavor, which I think tastes best if you mix it with iced tea, but that's just me. You can also mix this into salad dressings and pour it over your salads. You can put it into your soup mixes. There's a lot of ways that you can use this, but it's great that you're able to get all of your fruits and veggies in your diet so easily. So head to fieldofgreens.com and use the promo code Kim to get 15% off your first order. Again, it's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Kim to get 15% off your first order. All right, now on to the show. Let's talk with Vivek Ramaswamy, 2024 GOP presidential candidate. Vivek, welcome to the show.
It's good to be on. How are you?
Great. You know, you're a very interesting candidate, very intriguing. You've got an interesting, unique platform. Let's just start off, jump right on in. What is the problem with America and how are you going to fix it?
Well, I think a big part of the problem with America is that we're in the middle of a national identity crisis. Where if you ask people my age, I'm 37, I'm the first millennial ever to run for the presidency as a Republican. You ask people my age, what does it mean to be an American? You get a blank stare in response. And I think that's the vacuum at the heart of our national soul, where young people, really people of every age, Kim, across the country, we're so hungry for a cause. We're hungry for purpose and meaning and identity at a point in our national history when the things that used to fill our void of purpose, pick your favorite one, patriotism, faith, family, hard work, whatever it is, those things have largely disappeared. And that leaves a moral vacuum in its wake. And when you have a black hole, that's when poison fills the void. Now, we can debate what the poison is. You know, I'm a conservative, so I'll come from the right. I'll say some of that poison is woke ideology, looking at somebody on the basis of their genetic attributes rather than the content of their character, the climate cult, bowing down to, if you're not going to bow to God, you'll bow to a new God instead and not recognize it. Might be the wave of depression, mental health epidemic, anxiety. We can maybe, I think that's what maybe distinguishes people in different parts of the political spectrum is what you'll describe as the poison. But for the purpose of our discussion, it almost doesn't matter. Whatever the poison is, it's just a symptom of a deeper void of purpose and meaning and identity in our country. And I think that's an opportunity for new leaders to step up. That's what I'm trying to do here. To fill that void with the vision of what it means to be an American today, the ideals that set this ball game into motion 250 years ago, revive those ideals. That's how we dilute the poison to irrelevance, and that's how we give ourselves back a national self-confidence that I think we're lacking, that we've lacked for a very long time, but which I think we can actually revive as the first step to then unlocking our economy, standing up to China on the global stage. That stuff becomes easier once we revive our self-confidence, our deeper sense of who we really are as a people. And that's what I'm trying to deliver.
So that sounds like patriotism. Is that what you're, I mean, how would you even go about infusing this sort of new American patriotism into our society? Would it be like sort of Pledge of Allegiance in schools, or how would you get this ideology out there?
I think first, so I call myself an America First conservative. Checks a labeling. If you have to pick a box that you're going to check, that's the box I would check.
Okay.
But to put America first, right, we have to rediscover what America is. So yes, patriotism sounds fine. Civic pride, I talk about national identity and civic pride. That's how I say it. But about what? Right? What are we proud about? What is the national identity itself? Patriotic about what? It's not this geographic landmass we call America, right? You and I have two different shades of melon. We're two different genders. We're more than a diverse group of two-legged higher mammals walking some geographic space, doing what our iPhone tells us to do on a given day. That's not America. It is, in a strict definition, a geographic space, and it's a beautiful one. But that's not America. America is a vision of what that place can be. So I think first, before we get into policy, although we can, I think policy is important, but it's not the most important part of actually the next president's job. I think the most important part of the next president's job is to lead in a way that embodies a national character that we lack, embracing ideals like merit and the pursuit of excellence and free speech and open debate as the way we settle our political differences rather than the use of force, embracing the rule of law as part of what it means to be an American, embracing this radical dream that our citizens had, that our founding fathers had, that I have as a citizen for that matter today, that the people who we elect to run the government, even the president of the United States, ought to at least be the ones who actually run the government rather than a managerial bureaucracy that runs the show. That's where we are today, is we're in a 1776 moment where we need to rediscover and revive those ideals themselves. And so, Kim, the first step I would say is, yeah, we could talk about the tactics, civic education, this, that, the other thing. I have a lot of ideas myself. And I've spent years thinking about these ideas, so I have high conviction in some of them, but maybe I'm wrong about some of them. Maybe there's others that I haven't thought of, but those are tactics. The real theory of the case here, the real heart of the matter, is we need to rediscover what America is. And I think the next president, I think Reagan did this in some ways in the 1980s. I think the next president has an opportunity to deliver in 2024 what Ronald Reagan did in 1980, which is to lead us out of a national identity crisis as a leader of a country, irrespective of the policy-making levers that we use to revive that national character. In fact, much of it isn't going to be even through the policy levers, but through the leadership and the character of leadership that we bring to the White House itself. That might be the most important thing that I do as president if I'm elected, actually. We can get into the range of policy, and we're very specific on policy,
Right.
But I think that's secondary to the national character.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is a lot of culture, that this is, you're wanting to reshape the culture, and you've even said that you're the woke candidate. Am I getting that right? Like you're the first candidate running on wokeism?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be what you'd call the woke candidate.
No,
but,
that you're fighting wokeism, or
yeah, I mean, so sort of. I would say Ron DeSantis might call himself the anti-woke candidate. I think
Right.
I'm probably the candidate who has thought the most deeply about what woke ideology represents. But unlike Ron DeSantis or others who have taken that as their mantle, I'm not just running from something. I'm interested in running to something. I think the way we defeat fill in the blank, wokeism, gender ideology, what I call the climate cult, COVIDism, it's a religion or became a religion in its own right, globalism more broadly. The way we defeat the poison is to dilute it to irrelevance, not by taking a hammer and pounding it into the ground. That I think in many ways can inflame the problem. We dilute the poison to irrelevance with a vision of actual human identity, American identity, that's runs so deep that the woke stuff becomes silly and melts away by comparison. That's where I'm a little different than Ron DeSantis.
Okay. Do you think that I understand there's a big culture war going on in society right now, but do you think that government really has a place in shaping that culture? Should the culture war be fought in the culture and government should be running policies? How do you think government can be shaping, or should the government even be shaping culture?
I think the problem is the government has been shaping it, and the government should get out of the way of shaping it. That's the change that I think we need to make. So
Right.
let's just
Okay.
now get into a specific of one example. I mean, we could go in any number of directions, but I'll give you one embodiment of an example of what I mean. I've said that I would end race-based affirmative action in America. How would I do it? Was it by intervening in the private sector and telling companies they can and can't make decisions in certain ways? No. It's actually by rescinding an executive order signed by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. 11246 is this particular executive order, which said that in order to do business with the federal government, that's not some arcane category. It's 20% of the U.S. workforce works for a company that fits this description. You have to, as a private company, adopt race-based quota systems in order to win government work. I think that's wrong. I think that is the government inserting itself in an otherwise non-existent culture war, but creating one by causing companies to then adopt race-based quota systems to be eligible to operate their business, to be able to sell a vehicle to the federal government. That means you're doing business with the federal government, if you're a car company. That's what I mean, is I think in many ways the government has perpetuated the very kind of cultural cancers that we now suffer. And so I don't land on the side of saying the government now needs to foist right-wing values using state power to do it. That's where I differ from maybe other Republicans. But I do think that it is the job of the next president to not turn a blind eye to the realities of the fact that we're not starting from a blank slate. We're starting from a heavily government interventionist starting point that we need to roll back a lot of that government intervention in order to allow the culture to actually sort itself out on its own terms, getting to where it is not through the invisible hand of the market, but with the invisible fist of government actually lurking behind the scene.
Okay, so I want to go through a range of different policy positions. My audience
Sure.
is heavily anti-establishment, very much. Lots of people watching this show love Ron DeSantis. Lots of people watching this show love Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Lots of them love Trump. Nobody loves Biden. I could pretty much confidently say that. Watch anybody watching this program. When it comes to, let's look at some of these other candidates and where you then fall in with them. Ron DeSantis and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. very much made their mark with COVID policies. Both of them are very, Ron DeSantis really ran a great government during the COVID, from my perspective, government policies in Florida, really gave people a lot of freedom, had a lot of common sense choices when he said, hey, when the vaccine rolls out, why are we giving this to 21-year-old grocery baggers? Why aren't we giving this to 65-year-olds first? That seems like the most common sense thing. Obviously, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been calling out the corruption of Big Pharma. You, interestingly, come from the pharmaceutical industry. You have not been a politician before, but you made your mark, made your money in a big tech, in a Roviant Sciences biotech company, right? Pharmaceuticals. How do you, with that being such a prominent, even with Trump and his, there's criticisms on his COVID policies with Operation Warp Speed, but by and large, much better than Joe Biden in a lot of ways. So that's one reason why all three of those candidates are really big. Where do you fit in that group, on that policy, and how do you reconcile coming from pharmaceutical? And right now, no one trusts the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, correctly is the answer. I mean, I understand this more deeply than somebody who's looking at this from the outside in. Just for people who are literally in the thick of the biotech industry, they will know that my business model was built based on capitalizing on the inefficiencies created by the corruption of pharma as a regulated industry. So if you go to the big pharma industry, I'm not a particularly popular figure. Actually, I built a multi-billion-dollar biotech mostly by calling a lot of pharma's bluffs, by developing medicines that they shamefully abandoned, that actually one of them is a life-saving drug for kids today, life-saving approved medicine. Another one is a drug for prostate cancer. These are drugs that literally were left by the wayside by big pharma for reasons that's a whole separate discussion for another day, unless you want to. That was my last career. I understand. I mean, I was kind of the anti-establishment guy in pharma in a way that earned me the ire of most big pharma CEOs, didn't make me a particularly popular figure. But you're right, I did develop a multi-billion-dollar company that developed life-changing and life-saving medicines. That being said, I'm with RFK on probably 90% of his perspectives here on the corruption, mutual corruption between the regulator and the regulated as it relates to the FDA and the pharma industry. I actually applaud most of Governor DeSantis' policies. I actually applaud Kristi Noem, who actually really led the way. One of the things that Governor DeSantis is good at, I really mean this as a compliment, is taking the best of others' ideas and then putting them into practice and executing them in the state of Florida. I think he did that with Kristi Noem and did that at scale in Florida in a way that I mostly respect. And you could second guess some of his decisions in retrospect, but that's not the place where I would have serious criticism of his policies. Mm-hmm. So I think that, Operation Warp Speed, I'm going to be honest with you, I would describe as a sad example of crony capitalism. I have long been against, you go back to February 2020, my first op-ed in the pages of the Wall Street Journal calling out the bluff of so-called public-private partnerships. That's a formula for corruption. What do we now see in retrospect was rampant corruption during much of that process happening as though we had a gun to our head under a rush. Now we regret many of the crony capitalist decisions that the government made at behest of private influence. I'd say the same thing with respect to, a lot of other public-private partnerships, but I think it definitely applies to Operation Warp Speed. And so I'm probably closer to RFK than I am to Trump on this one. But I do believe that, for me, it's not a slogan. I've seen the other side of this. I think that I say this, I was trained as a scientist, right? So I graduated the top of my class in molecular biology from Harvard, went into the world of biotech. I care about the scientific method. I believe in the process of developing life-saving medicines for people. I think that the industry doesn't do enough of that, but plays a lot of games in return for actually getting rewarded by a system of mostly corrupt, self-created incentives foisted on them by the FDA and the federal government. I don't know where pharmaceutical companies actually really made out like bandits during COVID. People haven't paid attention to this. It's not even the vaccines. That's just a small handful of companies. The companies selling antidepressants and medicines for anxiety. You think about what lockdown policies did. Depression and anxiety are up. People hopefully appreciate that this is a big deal. Twofold in the last 3 years in this country, with antidepressant scripts along with it to go up. That's really where the pharmaceutical industry is made out like bandits. And, it's been a hedged trade for them. I had my first career in the world of hedge funds. Heads I win, tails you lose. And I think in many ways, pharma has been on the winning side of that trade over the last several years. And so I think we got to go past the slogans and get to the essence of what's actually happening. I understand that more deeply than most. And that's part of how my background helps me.
Let's talk about the military-industrial complex. Where do you stand on that and the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so the superficial answer, and then I want to get deeper. Superficial answer is I wouldn't give another penny of aid to Ukraine. This is not America's war to fight. This doesn't advance American interests. I think the deeper answer is I have frustrations with the quality of debate on both sides of the debate. I mean, your fellow Republicans in this field, I'm not going to pick on Democrats here, they're way off the reservation on this. So we're going to put that to one side. But even in the Republican field alone, you have certain Republicans, the Tim Scotts, the Nikki Haley's, the Mike Pences of the world, which toe the party line and say we must stand with Ukraine without specifying any clear limits whatsoever on what the scope of that aid could possibly be. I mean, we've already given them more than their entire GDP one or two orders of I think 2 orders of magnitude more than their own annual military defense budget. We have more than fulfilled the promises of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which they invoke as though any of them has actually read it. I actually have. Give us some clear limits. There's no principle there. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit disappointed with people who nominally have my own view here, which is that we shouldn't give any more money to Ukraine, without explaining how that actually advances American strategic objectives. Trump's said that he would end the war in 24 hours, hasn't said how. Ron DeSantis has flip-flopped 3 times over, right? Before he said he was for it, he gave his responses to Tucker saying he wasn't against it, or said that he was against it, called it a territorial dispute, like the next day reversing course, I think, after donors and establishment Republicans denounced that. So I don't know where he stands on it. That's why I see a void. So I'm actually, as of at least when we're having this conversation, I don't know when you're going to drop this podcast, but this Friday in New Hampshire, I'm giving a detailed speech laying out exactly the way I would end the Ukraine war. I think we deserve transparency on that. I don't believe in this cop-out of saying that, well, I don't want to give away our strategy, and so I'm not going to say it. That's a cop-out. Okay, that means somebody doesn't know what they actually think, and they're just hiding it from you as an excuse. I think it's actually going to be good for us to state our strategy and for the next president to pre-articulate that and stick to it. Here's how I would do it. I think the number one threat to the United States right now is the military alliance between Russia and China. I think we can end the Ukraine war right now by entering a peace treaty with Russia, between the U.S. and Russia, that as a condition for permanently saying that Ukraine will not enter NATO, freeze the current lines of war, Korean War-style armistice agreement, freeze it. Yes, that gives most of the Donbass region to Russia. So be it. No entering Ukraine, no entering NATO for Ukraine, no arming Ukraine with any more weapons. That's big concessions to Russia. We make Russia concede their treaty with China. The 2001 treaty and the 2022 treaty, they exit their treaty of mutual cooperation and military cooperation with China. That's a win. So we go from a bilateral international order of the U.S. and China, which now favors China, to a trilateral international order of Russia, U.S., and China, neither of which are dependent on the other. That is actually how we both restore peace, normalize relations with Russia in the process, and mostly deter Chinese aggression, which actually ought to be our main concern. And the irony is, I think the low-resolution, traditional, institutionalist, uniparty vision of the Ukraine war is that if somehow Vladimir Putin succeeds in defeating Ukraine, then that's going to embolden Xi Jinping to go for Taiwan, as though Xi Jinping reasons by analogy. When in fact, I think you could flip that on its head and say that actually, if we can end this war by just negotiating a peace treaty, telling Ukraine we're done supporting you, bring Russia to the table, freeze the lines of control, and say, actually, we won't even let Ukraine enter NATO, but here's the one thing we need from you is you enter your military partnership with China. That makes China at least have to think twice. I think they wouldn't at that point go for Taiwan. And we've accomplished that without going to war. That's actually the way we need to be thinking about how we advance U.S. strategic objectives without going to war in ways that go beyond, frankly, the superficial arguments that you definitely hear from the pro-Ukraine intervention camp. But even the absence of what I just shared with you, I haven't heard anybody else in the field offer. And it's not, this shouldn't be ingenious stuff that I'm sharing with you. This is pretty basic reasoning, first principles of putting American interests first, dealing with the top threat of China without going to war. Put those principles together, that leads to exactly this conclusion. And so I'm going to lay that on a speech in New Hampshire, in part because I think it takes an outsider to do it. I'm not captured by some existing foreign policy establishment. I think the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about is real, far more real today than it was even during Eisenhower's day. And we need the ability to cut through the BS that they will throw as their smokescreen to be able to get to truth. And that's a big part of why I'm in this race, is to cut through a lot of that and get to truth.
Okay, so let's talk about China and Taiwan. I don't agree with you that that Russia deterring Russia would end up ultimately deterring China. I think China is going to go after Taiwan no matter what. I think China views Taiwan as China, and kind of rightfully so when you look at the history of it, the war that they had, and one side ran off.
I just want to be clear about one thing.
Sure.
One thing about my position, just so you know whether we're agreeing or not. I said the traditional view, establishment view, is deterring Russia from Ukraine would deter China from Taiwan. I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I don't agree with that. My view is, I think that that's a silly view, actually. So I just wanted to clarify that. That's not my view. My view is, if we undermine or we cause Russia to agree as a consequence for ending the Ukraine war and not longer supporting Ukraine, and a few other things we can give Russia, like normalized relations, to exit its own military treaty with China,
right, to not
then
give them
China's
support.
less likely to go for Taiwan because
Right.
The way China thinks about it is the U.S. is not going to risk war with two simultaneous nuclear powers, Russia and China, at the same time. Well, if Russia's no longer coupled with China, China no longer, I think, is as confident in its ability to go after Taiwan.
Right. So you're saying that you're arguing that China needs Russia's support essentially, or that China needs Russia in the game, in the mix, kind of splitting the field a bit in order for them to go after Taiwan. Totally understand that, but I don't think China's planning to go after Taiwan militarily in that way. If they did anything, it would just be a blockade. Taiwan's main trade partner is China. Like most of all the countries actually in the Asia region, China is the number one trade partner. All they would need to do is do a blockade in order to get Taiwan to really be brought to their knees. If that were to happen, what do you think the United States should do? Should the United States go in militarily and defend Taiwan?
So you're raising a good point. First of all, I think that China has a menu of options, and I think that the dissolution of the treaty between Russia and China further reduces the chance that they do choose to go militarily. I think that there's also another big factor is the election in Taiwan. There's an election in Taiwan, a presidential election in 2024. If there's a more nationalist leader in charge, I think they will be less likely to be persuaded into a bear hug in the context of a blockade. So I think there are variables, and we would be, engaged in hubristic predictive prowess that none of us have when those variables could result in three ways: status quo, blockade, or invasion. I think invasion is a bad case. We should avoid it without going to war. And I think that the way that we could settle Ukraine can actually accomplish that. That's part of my foreign policy vision here. As it relates to the blockade, so if we have semiconductor self-sufficiency in this country, that really changes the game and ought to change the game about what we are and aren't willing to do. Part of the reason that China wants to go for Taiwan, I think there's two principal reasons why China wants to go for Taiwan. They're very different from each other. And if I could get into Xi Jinping's head and understand which one was really motivating him, and I'm not sure that he knows, it may vary on a given day, it would be really valuable to know. But the two things are, one is it's a nationalistic project dating back from 1949, right? Chiang Kai-shek, and reunifying a country which they view as still in the midst of the remnants of a civil war that they need to close the loop on. The second objective, though, is it's like the equivalent of squatting on treasure, the keys to the kingdom, which are today the chips that power our modern way of life, our phones, to the, refrigerator that kept this bottle of water cold before we're drinking it, to this camera that you and I are talking through right now, are powered by advanced semiconductors. Those originate from the island of Taiwan, specifically even a small subset of companies, most of which is in TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, semiconductor manufacturing company. So that's reason number two, is China's grand bargain with the U.S. that they dream of, that right now we, and to date would say hell no to, is we get your IP, China would say to us, but we'll get to make your stuff instead. Right now, the U.S. has no reason to say yes to that because we could still have redundancies in getting our stuff made by other partners. But if they're really squatting on the semiconductor supply chain, which powers our entire modern way of life, that gets China to, I don't think China's game is to go to outright war with the U.S. No, they want a new equilibrium, a new world order where they consummate the codependent relationship, where we give them our IP and they get to make our stuff. And we're both in need of one another. And Taiwan helps them consummate that coup. The best way to undermine that, I think, is so everything in my foreign policy vision is, how do we avoid that situation without going to war? I think we're still in a window where that's possible. One of the ways I would do it is pull Russia's support back from out of China, because even a blockade is a step taken. It's a risk and a gambit to the backdrop of war. They have to take that into account. That's one thing I've said. Another thing I've said is I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment here in the United States. I mean, the founding fathers put the Second Amendment in for a reason. They wanted to make sure that the government we created doesn't do to its citizens what the monarchy tried to do to them, which is to take away the backstop of actually securing our rights. In my speech to the NRA, I said I would export the Second Amendment to Taiwan, open a branch of the NRA or an equivalent in Taiwan, put a gun legally in every Taiwanese household, train them how to use it. That will make Xi Jinping absolutely think twice. There's a reason why China secures all the freedoms that we offer in our Bill of Rights except the Second Amendment. But a third way is securing the semiconductor supply chain. So if the U.S., through partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and even onshoring here in the United States, I'm talking to you from central Ohio, where we're literally seeing built here, an Intel-built semiconductor chip manufacturer with advanced leading edge semiconductors. That's one of the reasons why it would, A, reduce China's own incentive to go for Taiwan, because one of those two reasons is then less appealing if they don't really hold the keys to the kingdom after all. But the second thing is, there's an optimistic version of this, where part of what Xi Jinping may say is if on a good day, he's just motivated by his nationalistic instincts of the unfinished business of 1949 and Chiang Kai-shek, he may say, let the U.S. finish getting its semiconductor preparedness so that I can do my nationalistic thing that Mao Zedong didn't get done in 1949, and the U.S. would have no reason to go to war with me. And I think there's a reasonable case to say that U.S. intervention there, it's now no longer in the same category. It's more like Ukraine than it is like Taiwan is today if we actually have semiconductor self-sufficiency. So I think that, again, it really involves getting into that level of detail. And so my view is, in the meantime, what do? Deter China from going after Taiwan until we fully have semiconductor self-sufficiency in this country. And then once we do, that significantly lowers the stakes and reduces the probability of war while still keeping America strong. That's what I care about. That's the kind of foreign policy vision that I do think it takes an outsider to bring to the table who's grounded in facts and understand what's actually going on. And that's, a big part of why I'm in this race is to represent American interests with fortitude, but to do it in a way that preserves peace rather than going to war. And, I know people in as you would call the military-industrial complex might root for otherwise. That's not the camp I'm in.
Let's talk about Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. What would you do with them if you were president?
Assange is an easy case. Assange is a pardon. I would pardon Julian Assange. Again, let's get into the details here, right? He wasn't even the person who ever assumed an obligation to the government. He was a journalist who published what was given to him and leaked by a government actor. That is literally how most of Washington, D.C.'s political press corps works. Assange was singled out as a disfavored person for publishing the kind of information that the rest of the establishment, including the fourth branch in the Washington, D.C. Media Bureau, acknowledged that that's not the kind of stuff you're supposed to print, even though the other stuff that gets leaked is totally fine putting in the Washington Post on a given day. That's completely disparate treatment. And then the double irony is that Chelsea Manning, the individual who actually did assume an obligation to the government and leaked it, had Chelsea Manning is now I'm not taking it. Is it a man now?
Oh, no, it was Brad. That
woman now. Sorry.
Yeah.
So had her sentence commuted because she is trans. Really, just call a spade a spade. If Chelsea Manning was not trans, if that was not a politically popular thing for Obama to do, he wouldn't have done it. And yet, the person who committed the breach of that very flow of material had her sentence commuted. And yet, Julian Assange, the person who merely published it without any obligation to the U.S. government at all, is actually the one who's sitting in exile. That is not the rule of law. That is an abandonment of the rule of law. So I would pardon Assange. On Snowden, I admire what Snowden did. I'm conflicted on the pardon. I'm thinking through it. Be honest with you. You're catching me at a moment where I haven't said something about it publicly because I'm still trying to do this thing that we're supposed to do, I think, is think deeply about where we stand and why. And the reason it's a harder case for me is part of what makes it honorable to operate outside the system and make that sacrifice is that it does involve sacrifice, right? And so in his case, like in the Chelsea Manning case, made an intentional decision to say, I've made a commitment, but in the hour of extreme need, I am still intentionally breaching a commitment that I have made in an act of civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. That part of what makes that admirable is the willingness to make the sacrifice that goes along with it. And so my instinct right now is after a certain amount of time, that sacrifice has been made, and then we close the loop in the chapter by issuing that pardon and moving on, recognizing what has actually happened. But I think that Assange is the easy case. I would absolutely partner Julian Assange. I'm actually trying to go see him in the UK. So I don't know if, I know you've talked to Glenn Greenwald and others about the possibility, or folks in your orbit, frankly.
Yeah, I could
If
talk
others
to his
have good
wife
suggestions.
or his brother or his father for
Yeah,
you.
so that's something
if
we're
you wanna
working
do
on
it.
now.
Yeah.
Because I'm supposed to go to the
That would be amazing.
UK this fall, and I wanted to combine that with
They
the
don't
trip to
let
see him.
people visit with them. It's very
Well, I want to
bizarre.
change that. I want to have
Yeah.
an open. It is. That's what I've heard. But we want to make that happen this fall, because I do think that's something that, whether it's peaceful protesters on January 6th here in the United States, whether it's anybody who's been a victim of a politicized prosecution. How I define that is, if somebody else under similar circumstances ordinarily would not have been prosecuted, but this individual was, that's a basis for pardon in my book. And I'm going to issue that. It's one of the rare areas where you can actually go back in time and fix a wrong. I have a responsibility as the president to actually do it.
When it comes to Edward Snowden, I mean, maybe this will make it a little easier for you. If I take a job with an employer and I sign a contract, a non-disclosure agreement, I've agreed to work for this company to protect their secrets, and I discover that they're committing a crime, is it not my responsibility to report that crime?
You
And
do.
if
And
I
every
report that crime,
Yeah.
should I then be punished by the company, sued by the company, let's say, punished by the company in some way, or even jailed for exposing the crime that the boss that I'm working for commits? The only difference with this is that Edward Snowden was working for the United States government, but the government was committing a crime against the people that he exposed, right?
Totally.
So should he
Totally.
be punished for exposing the crime of his employer?
So, I'm a first principles guide
It's just
to the
something
letter.
to
So I'm
think
gonna,
about. Yeah.
Yeah, no. So I'll give you the analogy here, just to be. I don't mean to be boringly technical about it, but like even in our legal regime, every non-disclosure agreement that you sign, literally, the law requires, in order for a non-disclosure agreement to be enforceable, to have carve-outs for any illegality being exempt from the scope of that non-disclosure agreement, or else under the
Right.
law we don't enforce it. Our governments do not have, in the national security establishment, that kind of commitment attached to it. So I think that we can revisit that entire regime. But ex ante, when we're talking about a politicized prosecution, Assange is absolutely a politicized prosecution. In Snowden's case, I admire him. I think he's a hero, actually. That's where I am on Edward Snowden. But it's part of, it's like Martin Luther King. Let's take that. Part of what made him a hero was that he was willing to go to jail in Birmingham for the act of civil disobedience that made the whole thing actually work. Because we got to where we are because of that sacrifice. So it's almost a poetic worldview that acknowledges that the Assange case is fundamentally different than either the Chelsea Manning or the Edward Snowden one, even though I admire each of them for doing what they did. Assange literally had no obligation. That fits my definition of a politicized prosecution. That's not a political decision for me to pardon him. That is a legal decision for me to pardon him. In Snowden's case, it would be more of a moral. Yeah, in Snowden's case, it would be more of a moral decision.
Not real. I mean, you could say, look, if we have these carve-outs for private businesses, why don't we have these carve-outs for the government as well? And we need to go back in time, and we need to correct that. And so it's not really a political decision. This is a legal decision. We should make these same carve-outs for the government that we do for private entities, and therefore anybody who was prosecuted under those who otherwise would be applauded by society for exposing crimes of their employer, we should be then commuting their sentences or dropping their sentences or pardoning them and making these rules and retroactively doing it. Sort of similar to what we do to like marijuana, for example.
I got you.
When it's same sort of thing.
So like I told you, I'm not against that. I told you I'm actively thinking through and considering the Snowden case. The justification that I was making my progress on was actually different than what you laid out. I think it's a pretty interesting way of framing it in the way you laid that out as well. But honestly, sharing with you where I am, we're at a hard yes on Assange, and I think our intuitions are in the same place on Snowden.
Well, maybe you'll change your mind after this conversation. Okay.
Yeah, well, I haven't made up my mind is exactly where I'm at on Snowden.
Understand completely. We don't have much time left, so I do want to roll through a couple big things here. FBI and CIA, where are you with these three-letter agencies? Do you want to abolish them?
Down.
Okay.
Shut it down. The administrative state is unconstitutional as it exists. Now, even if you think about the FBI, even I try to persuade friends who think of this as think I'm being radical. This is actually a pragmatic thing to do. Even at the local level, you have local police and local prosecutors. You don't have a giant investigative unit sitting in between. At the federal level, you got U.S. Marshals. You have a Department of Justice and an Attorney General. Now, they have their own issues, especially the Department of Justice, but put that to one side. When you put an investigative bureaucracy that sits in between, that is a formula for corruption. It is still the J. Edgar Hoover building of the FBI that people walk into today. The same J. Edgar Hoover FBI that threatened Martin Luther King with suicide, to commit suicide, back in the 1960s is now going after different political opponents today. These are corrupt. I think I've been probably the most vocal candidate over the course of the last several years on the constitutional basis for how the U.S. president absolutely is constitutionally authorized to shut down the administrative state and restore one executive branch of government rather than two, which is what we have today.
You've talked about shutting down a lot of government. What other areas of the government do you want to shut down? You've mentioned there would be a lot of job loss, so I'm curious what you think what would happen to those people that would lose their jobs in the government, and what entities and agencies do you want to shut down?
U.S. Department of Education shouldn't exist. Shut it down. $90 billion freed up. Give it back to the people. IRS, fundamentally corrupt organization, folded into literally a revenue collecting administrative function within the Treasury, rather than now even the so-called debt deal that somehow the Uniparty is both all in favor of right now is actually arming those IRS agents with far more power than they should have ever had. The ATF, I think, is something that doesn't need to exist in the context of a reconstituted limited federal police apparatus. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, fundamentally hostile to nuclear energy. That's a problem. Shouldn't exist. The culture of that agency has become exactly what it is. The U.S. Federal Reserve, I've said I would cut over 90% of the headcount at the U.S. Federal Reserve. Put back in place a single mandate of stabilizing the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, rather than trying to play financial god of matching and balancing inflation and unemployment, which has proven to be a 25-year national disaster. So I could continue to go on, but it is an expansive vision grounded in Article 2 of the Constitution that I think empowers the next president to shut down government agencies that have either become so ossified and corrupt that they cannot be reformed, or government agencies, which is most of them, that should not have existed in the first place. And then I've said I would replace civil service protections with a new HR policy, all right, which is 8-year term limits for the bureaucrats instead. To say that if I can't, as the leader of the executive branch, collect a paycheck from the taxpayer for more than 8 years, which I think is a good thing, then neither should any of those federal bureaucrats reporting into me either. That's what keeps the lifeblood fresh. People lose their jobs, we say. Well, it's not the job of the taxpayer to keep a bunch of bureaucrats employed. To the contrary, open your eyes and look at the private sector. We have a worker shortage in this country. Maybe some of them can actually find useful, honest work, and many of them are good people. I'm confident that they will, but I don't think that the employment concerns in the federal government should be the tail that wags the dog of the administrative state.
Do you think if you did it that way, that there would be high-quality talent that would be attracted to a job that only lasts 8 years? I think most people like to have some job security, a future. They want to be able to buy a home. They want to be able to start a family. They want to be able to pay off their college debt. And if you offer them a job that lasts only 8 years and you say, I don't know what you're going to do at the end of these 8 years, I'm not sure if you're going to get the highest quality people in those positions.
You know, I respectfully disagree. I actually think you do. It depends on what quality means. But I think if you want, I don't think selecting for somebody whose aspiration is to be a career state bureaucrat for the rest of their life, I don't think that should actually be the kind of person that we want wielding executive authority over people's lives, which are generally in a liberty constricting direction than a liberty enhancing one. It's just the nature of what the administrative state does. I think we should want people who view themselves as living out a limited term service to the country to actually protect the Constitution and the laws rather than to view those as inconveniences. I think that's actually, the selection bias would tilt in the right direction for the kind of people that we should want staffing the federal government. I don't want to be president forever. I mean, I think, honestly, there's parts of the job that seem deeply unattractive to me. But
Right.
I think you want someone who views it as making a time-limited contribution, drive as much change in a positive direction as you can, and then go on and have a positive impact in the world and live a great life in other ways. I think that's what we want more of in the character of who we actually have in Washington, D.C. And by the way, speaking of the administrative state, I'm moving half of it out of Washington, D.C. Part of the reason why is I think we need agencies. You know, there's no point in having a Department of Agriculture that sits in the confines of Washington, D.C. It's also how you downsize without severance costs. Move the job, half the people from D.C. won't want to move. Great. We save the taxpayers on the severance costs for those people that don't want to make the move either. But, you know, you could call me radical on some of this stuff, but I actually think that this is the way the government was envisioned to work at our founding. I don't think it should be a radical idea to restore 3 branches of government rather than 4. That's what the Constitution enshrined.
Interesting. Where are you at on taking big money donors for your campaign?
I'd do a deal with every candidate in this race where if we all sign up and say we want to shun the money of super PACs, I'm in. In fact, if I'm the nominee for the general election, let's say it's Joe Biden, a lot easier if it's RFK. I'd like for it to be him, but because he'd probably agree to this deal sooner than Biden. I'm sure he would. But to say that, hey, Republican, Democrats who used to say you want to keep big money out of politics, I'm going to give you your wish. Let's do it. Not by changing any laws. Let's just do a handshake and say that we're both going to shun super PAC money for the general election. Deal or not? I don't think Biden would do that deal. And I think it reveals the farce at the heart of, both parties are corrupted in their own ways. I would do it with the other candidates in the Republican primary, for that matter, right? I think that it's sad to see, but some of the loudest voices, even in this Republican primary, they're very careful about what they do and don't touch based on who their donors are. And my goal is not to call out any specific candidate, but I do think that many professional politicians who talk a big game about a lot of the issues that they, speak loudly about, they really end up carrying a small stick, to turn Teddy Roosevelt's expression on its head, when it comes to what their donor class does and doesn't let them say. And I think that that's the sad reality of what it means to live in the modern Republican Party.
So to be clear, you are going to take big money unless the other candidates shun big money. And then in which case you will as well.
So I'm de-emphasizing. It is a huge emphasis in other people's campaigns.
Yeah.
We didn't, for the first 3 months of the campaign, do a fundraiser, right? We were focused on small dollar donors giving $5, $1, $20 at a time. So that's where my focus is. I'm not turning it away, right? I mean, I'm not turning it. I don't check somebody's balance sheet and say that if you are wealthy, that we're going to turn your money away. But I actually would go in the direction of saying that all of us as candidates can absolutely shun and reject super PACs, but I'm competing to win this race. I'm not in this to change the terms of debate. I'm in this to unlock an American revival, and that's going to require winning the election. And so that's going to require, I think, a firm commitment from everybody that we're going to do this together, but I am willing to lead the way, and it's certainly not the emphasis of where I spend my time or energy. And that also leaves me unconstrained to adopt some of the policy positions I have with respect to economic independence from China, with respect to shutting down the administrative state, with respect to calling out the corruption in the Silicon Valley bank depositor bailout. I mean, there's a difference between myself and Ron DeSantis, right? Ron DeSantis, on paper, you would predict, would be against that, hasn't said a peep. Why? Because one of his big donors was the number one proponent of that bailout and beneficiaries of that bailout, who was also not only one of his biggest donors and fundraisers, but also the person who hosted the Twitter spaces that launched him, onto the presidential scene. And so I'm not criticizing DeSantis for that. I'm criticizing a system, including in the Republican Party, though I think it's arguably even worse today in the Democratic Party, that effectively turns professional politicians into their puppets. And the sad part is, folks like Trump, I know he had his own money the first campaign. I've put 8 figures of our own family's money, self-earned. I didn't grow up in money, but I've lived the American dream. That's what it takes to declare independence. But we're in a phase of my career where we're not looking at making money. We're looking at how we save the country. And I did not want to, and I did not. And I refused to ring a tin can and asking a bunch of donors for permission to run, taking a hat in hand, running around the country. I didn't want to debase myself doing it. I couldn't bring myself to do that anyway. We just said we're going to write the 8-figure check and we'll make it 9 figures if necessary, but that's what it's going to take to run independently. And we'll take the small dollar donors along with us. And then, if the other candidates want to do a deal and say we'll shun the super PAC money, great, I'm in. So that's where I'm at on that.
Vivek, it was great chatting with you. Really appreciate it. It's great to see younger blood in the race for sure. So
thank you.
Definitely wish you the absolute best. Where can people go to learn more about your campaign?
Vivek2024.com, Vivek 2024.com. And by the way, the first debate's in August. We want to be at the center of that debate stage. Forget giving a lot of money. Give $1. Go to Vivek2024.com. Apparently, the number of unique donations what the Republican Party says they're looking at, that sounds great. We don't need big money. We'll take $1 money. So if people want to see this,
I'll give you $1.
Party evolve. I appreciate that.
I'll give $1 because I would love to see you on the debate stage. I think the more the merrier for sure. So I will help you with that, and hopefully others will as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Best of luck to you in the campaign, seriously.
We'll take it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation with Vivek Ramaswamy. He didn't have a lot of time, so he couldn't do an entire hour with us, but we were able to do 45 minutes, which was nice. Some things, so I kind of had to move a little faster through the questions and the conversation, more than I would normally like to do. Just a little recap on some of the things, some of my thoughts on some of the things that he said. Hopefully, first of all, maybe changed his mind on Edward Snowden. I think I gave him a really good analogy. He seemed to really think that over. He seemed to be persuaded. So perhaps if he were to become president of the United States, he would think back to this conversation and say, hey, maybe we do need to retroactively make the law correct. We need to correct the law with the federal government that if you expose government crimes, then you are not the criminal. As the same way, if you were to expose the crimes of your boss, you are not a criminal, even if you signed a non-disclosure agreement with your boss or signed some sort of "I'll protect your secrets." So maybe he'll change his mind on that one. Interesting about China, I didn't get a full, clear answer from him on his stance on whether or not the United States would protect Taiwan. It seemed vague to me, the answer. He seemed to be very concerned about semiconductors, moving that industry to the United States. I'm sure China could also move semiconductors to China. I don't think that China's interest in Taiwan is the semiconductors. I think China's been very much developing, growing their own industry, manufacturing, advancing very quickly. It's only a matter of time, similar to how it's only a matter of time that we potentially make semiconductors here in the United States. It's only a matter of time that they would make semiconductors on the mainland as well. I think China's interest in Taiwan is just dating back to the civil war that they've had, and they're wanting to tie up that civil war. They believe that land belongs to them because they won the war, and the other side that fled to the island did not. And they're wanting to unify in the same way that Hong Kong has been unified. And ultimately, when we think about the unification of Taiwan to China, if we look at Hong Kong and how it was done, you might not agree with some of the policies. Some of the people there might be dissatisfied with certain things that have changed in their lives. But by and large, the people in Hong Kong are still living a pretty good life. They're not at war. And that is because Hong Kong was reunited with China peacefully. It was done because it had to be done. The contract ended. And there were people that talked about not honoring the contract and just going to war and fighting for Hong Kong instead. Luckily, no one paid attention to that. But that was definitely a discussion at the time when the British Empire had to give back the land to China. The same sort of outlook could be done when it comes to Taiwan, looking at Taiwan and saying, if it comes down to it and China gets really aggressive about taking Taiwan, I don't believe that China's ever going to do it militarily, but I could be wrong. Absolutely. Anything could happen. I'm not privy to what the Chinese government is thinking. But more likely they would do it through a blockade, or more likely they would do it through other means of wanting to reunify. And they play a very long game, the Chinese. They're not looking at this in 4-year cycles or 8-year cycles or even 20-year cycles. They're looking at this in a 100-year cycle. How long is it going to take them to finally get Taiwan to unify? And they know that eventually it probably will happen, and they won't even need to go to war for it. I think what they're most concerned about is our military aggression against them, more than anything. And the reason why, of course, we have that military aggression is because we're trying to prevent them from unifying with Taiwan. But I didn't get a real clear answer out of Vivek on what he would do as president in the event of a clear threat from China against Taiwan. It was more of a let's deter. But my question is, okay, you've deterred. Now what when it didn't work? And that should be a real question that we should be asking all of our leaders. Are they going to march us into a war with China? That's a fair enough question for us to be asking. Another point that he spoke about was his idea of the 8-year term limit for bureaucrats in Washington. And of course, my point was, well, this is not term limits for elected officials. These are people that are hired to do jobs. If you tell a person you're only going to have this job for 8 years, they may or may not want to take that job. You might end up with a lower pool of talent. It's not the same as winning an election. Your name is out there. You become famous when you're a politician. You go back to your constituents in your district, and you could probably start a business and get a job, and you're now high society because you're a name. A bureaucrat isn't a name. These are people behind the desk. They're low-level people often, and so having a term limit on them, he was saying that he believed that it would attract high-quality people. My point was, I don't know if you're going to attract high-quality people when you're telling them they can only have an 8-year job and people are trying to build families and buy homes, and that's going to be very difficult for a bureaucrat. His point was, well, no, we need to get the bureaucrats out of there. We can't, we've got to drain the swamp, essentially. He said that without saying drain the swamp, right? Get them out of there, revolve around. We need fresh ideas. We need new people. The problem with the revolving door is the revolving door we see in Congress when people go from being a member of Congress to K Street. And we see this revolving door between the lobbyists and the politicians. And if you get bureaucrats in government and then they're coming from the private sector and they're going to have to leave in 8 years back to the private sector, who do you think they're going to be serving during those 8 years they're there? They're there to protect their future. So if they're going to protect their future, how are they best going to do it? By cozying up to the industry that they're going to want to enter as soon as they're out of there. That's the big problem we have in Washington right now with the swamp. People protecting their future interests. And they're thinking about, what am I going to do to make all the money when I'm out of here? And they then protect that interest while they're sitting in a government position. And that's a problem. So I do, I understand the sentiment of what he's trying to say. I appreciate the essence of the idea and the purpose of the idea, but I just don't think it would actually work. I think it would actually have the opposite effect, and we'd end up with a much swampier swamp than we have now if we force people to go into the private sector and back into government and into the private sector. Wasn't able to get to his, I didn't have enough time to ask him about Section 230, but I wanted to ask him about that because he had an interesting take that I heard on another interview he did that I had not heard before, and I liked it. And it was, his view on Section 230 is it should be opt-in for companies. So if you are Facebook or you are Twitter, you can opt in to Section 230 or not be in Section 230. So if you opt in and you agree to having all the government protections, then you cannot be censoring and you cannot be acting as a publisher for your platform. And if you do not opt in to Section 230, you then have the ability to censor and act as a publisher. You would act no different as any other journalistic outlet. You can, be the editor, and you can decide on what you want people to see and what you want and what you don't want people to see. That, of course, would then open you up to liability. It'd be very difficult to operate a social media platform without the protection of Section 230. My guess is most social media platforms would opt in to Section 230, and with that opt-in, they would have to know these are the parameters that you need to follow. You cannot censor. You're not publishing. You're not the publisher. You're not the editor. You're just providing the platform. That's what Section 230 does. I think most social media companies would go for that. And I thought that was a good idea because it forces them to choose rather than the government deciding, we're going to give you 230 or we're not going to give you 230. You're going to follow 230 or you're not. Instead, it says you can choose. Do you want to be a social media platform where you're going to invite millions and billions of users potentially to your platform, and in which case you don't know what they're going to say, you don't know what they're going to do, and you want the government's protection, or do you not? Or are you going to be like a media company where you're going to just publish content that you like, and in which case that takes a lot of staff. You're not going to have the user base. It's going to be a very different business model. Take your pick. And I think that's a fair way to deal with Section 230. I like that, actually. I like that a lot. Also, Ukraine war wasn't exactly clear, but, mostly he just said we shouldn't give them a dime anymore. We should end the conflict and we need to negotiate. But his ideas of negotiating with Russia were interesting. I don't know if it would work. Maybe it would. Saying, look, we'll end it. Ukraine won't be in NATO, but you can't be in a military alliance with China. Maybe that would work. And, that's also a viewpoint I had not heard. That's a strategy I had not heard. And at this point, I think we need all options on the table. Not that anyone's going to listen. Not that anyone's actually at the table paying any attention. But nonetheless, it was an interesting idea that I had not heard. So really overall enjoyed the conversation with Vivek. Vivek. Sorry, he taught me how to say his name properly. So if you want to know, it is Vivek, like cake, Vivek Ramaswamy. So great conversation with him. Wish him the absolute best. Very young guy, 37 years old. Wow, running for president. Good for him. And that is it for tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. Thank you so much for watching. Really a pleasure, guys. Have a great weekend. We will be back Monday, same time, same place, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble. Have a great night.